We come to the 23rd presentation in this year-long or this annual series of presentations. And they have a symmetry. On one hand, and handedness is a chirality of magnetism. It's always paired. On one hand, we're looking towards the future in vision. At the same time, but in a kaleidoscopic space, we're looking at the new past, which means that the past is not writ on stone, and even if it were, on the level that we're working, it's all malleable. Not just to be granulated or evaporated or even obviated. But there is a instantaneous absorption that characterizes reality, and paired, a spontaneous emergence. Subatomic particles can come in and out of so-called existence quicker than we could compute. It's standard issue. The future, visionarily, is kaleidoscopically malleable and not at all like current science fiction melodrama, something that one can compute now and organize so that one can get to control the future that one can see in one's mentality, one's mind, in one's equipment. This is naive, profoundly. The new past is chirally the other hand of the open future. And one of the qualities that interferes with that is the obstinate insistence on there being a present now that arbitrates that what's past is past and what's future is future. And from that erroneous zone, that pivot of ego, that position of mind, the past becomes something that can be controlled and indexed, and the future something that increasingly now can be controlled and planned for. And in this kind of arrogance, ignorance plays chaotic sandbox games. We're in the midst of huge planetary-wide, global-wide, arrogant sandbox games. You cannot count on a past that you think you can count on. For an example, when you come to the Bible, when you come to the New Testament, one of the most powerful of all the Gospels is the Gospel according to Luke. Luke was a physician, highly literate in Greek and Hebrew and many other languages, but he came late to a development that had become a game. He joined St. Paul late in Paul's game. And so his gospel has wonderful developments that we would not have had he have not researched and brought it through. he begins with John the Baptist and gives us a very good appreciation of this incredible way in which he came, not only in his pregnancy and eventual birth and his life and so forth, but the fact that the mother of John the Baptist, named Elizabeth, and her husband Zechariah, were deeply visionary. And Zechariah, being a Levite, would go from their, what we would call now, suburban town into Jerusalem to the temple to put his time in. And Elizabeth would have a vision about what she was carrying. And a relative of hers, Elizabeth was very old. She was almost too old to have children. In fact, was too old to have children, and yet she got pregnant. And at the same time, 6 months later, like a staggered thing. It's like when big things happen in nature, you get this kind of a delay. They're paired, but they're paired in the way in which hawks hunt in pairs, male and female. And the male will do one kind of circling, and the female will be back also circling, but not in tandem. Big things don't come in tandem. They come paired. And so one has to be patient and observant to understand that pairing is really deep. She was visited by the youngest daughter of her sister, whose name was Miriam, and she was had turned 16. She was married to her love, Joseph, and she was pregnant with Jesus. And Jesus was about 3 months along in the womb, and John the Baptist was almost ready to be born, almost 9 months. And Elizabeth felt the kicking of the embryo become a baby in her womb. And she realized that when Mary had come into the room, the baby she was carrying was related in some huge way to the baby that she was carrying and was about to birth. And these were auspicious times, as the Chinese would say. Everyone knew that we were not only on pins and needles, but we were on whirlwind. So Luke, in his gospel, records a hymnal-like poem for the vision of Elizabeth and the vision of Zechariah. And then he records a poem that he ascribes to the mother of Jesus, to Mary, the mother. It's called the Magnificat. And it's known for 2,000 years worldwide. It is not by the mother of Jesus. It's by the other Mary. It's by Mary Magdalene. And it's fiddled with and misquoted, misprinted, misread by Luke because Paul had adjusted it so that the birth of Jesus would be a Christ event and not a Jesus event of a man who could have not a sense of the present moment now in his time scaling, but a sense of presence. And that presencing was shareable. The present now is like that. It's insistently singular. So one longs for a singularity. It's insistently me. And so the origin of me in language comes from ancient Samaria. And it means the power that you have. And if you read the beautiful hymns of Ene Duwana, the 42 temple hymns, or her myths of Inanna, you see right away that that me carries on in the sense that me, in that I have three ways to deal with you. Me, myself, and I. And deal you will. It's all a game. It is an erasable, evaporatable, avoidable game. One doesn't even have to play games. In the collected spiritual odes of Solomon by Mary Magdalene, the second ode has always been missing since antiquity. It's not there. Even in the most meticulous collections, it's not there. It was there. It was the Magnificat. But it was edited out very, very quickly and very soon. And so it passed into oblivion, even the realization that Mary Magdalene was the greatest poet of the age. And that the odes of Solomon go back to a great lineage, go back to another great poetess who wrote the Song of Songs, the Queen of Sheba. Her personal name was Makeda. And she incorporated some of Solomon's wonderful poetic into her Song of Songs poetic. And she goes all the way back, reaching to Ene Duwana. So that Mary Magdalene has a pedigree, very much like the Gospel of Matthew starts out with the pedigree of Jesus. These are the generations of Jesus. Son of David, son of Abraham. 1,000 years, 2,000 years. He's a double millennial being. He's at home with what in antiquity was called an aeon. Understands generations, and that in between what he was to emerge after his resurrection would be the 42nd generation since Abraham. And Duwana's temple hymns are 42, etc., etc. The generations in Matthew are divided from Abraham to David, which is 1,000 years, is 14 generations. It's right there at the beginning of the New Testament. From David to the birth of Jesus has a dividing split midway. It's the exile, the being carried away into exile. It's the capture. And from David to being carried away is 14 generations, and from the return of being carried away to Jesus is 14 generations in his capacity to not only be the 41st generation, but to re-emerge as the 42nd. You can get happy feet on 42nd Street. Every Broadway musical knows that. The obviation of the past is cataclysmic. It is such a catastrophe that from time to time, when time reaches its energetic nodes in its frequency cycling, time, especially because it has become condensed and magnified, condensed to the subatomic level to where we're dealing with vacuum energy that is creative, like the Higgs boson, and magnified to where we can see the early galactic wonder from 13 billion light years away. Plenty of time for us to allow the present to dissolve in a fine glass of presence. Here is a little something. This is the way it's done. This was done 2,500 years ago by Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching. This is my translation. I worked on it for about 35 years. San Francisco, Canada, here, so forth. The 14th, Lao Tzu did not divide his Tao Te Ching into sections. That was done much later in the Han Dynasty, about 300 years later. The original Tao Te Ching is 5,500 characters in a cascade, no punctuation whatsoever. The articulation in the hearing or the reading out loud, because in Chinese, with all the intonations, the character can mean many different things. You have to know the intonation. You also have to have the rhythm, and there's also that amazing quality of language, silences. You have to pace. And so language becomes incredibly, not just inflective, but kaleidoscopically poetic. And this is the translation of the 14th section of the Tao Te Ching, praising the profound. Looking, presence unseen is named colorless. Listening, presence unheard is named soundless. Reaching, presence beyond grasp is named incorporeal. These, thus, themselves, not subject to objectivity. Therefore, deeply paired in a unitus, surface never clarified, but bottoms not obscure, continuously continuous. Oh, no one can name. Reverts, returns, non-thing existence, called non-formed presence. A form of non-image iterating, thus forming, is abstrusely abstruse. The front of presence, not seeing, quote, ahead. The rear of presence, never seen, quote, behind. Holding fast as ancients' presence, Tao. There, governed immediately our existence. Now you know our ancients' beginning, called Tao thread. When you have not only the visionary field open, where differential consciousness is totally free eternally, the art that can emerge must emerge spontaneously. If it is planned in any way, its plan has its own plans. Planning has its own platform. Yes, it's different from time to time, age to age. No one writes in Middle English anymore, except Tolkien. And he made up an elfin language out of Middle English to sing Middle English style in Middle Earth with the best of them, like Chaucer and the author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In fact, he learned so well, he did the great first really comprehensive poetic edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Still on print. But the quality that is needed is something that emerges spontaneously. And for that, I'm coming to my translation of Zarathustra, his Gathas, in his language of Avestan. In Avestan, Gathas becomes, in Sanskrit, Gita. Just like mantra in Zarathustra becomes mantra in Sanskrit. And we're going to talk about Sanskrit in just a moment. Asha is one of the 6 spirit helpers, guides. 3 feminine and 3 masculine. Asha is feminine. She is the order that spontaneously can come into instantaneous existence, come alive into life, and become conscious life that respects and not only integrates all the rest of it, but differentially opens up the freedom of all of it. Vohuman is the masculine complement to Asha, is not the clear mind so much, but the good thinking mind. And good thoughts always have a free quality to them. They color outside the lines. Instead of one having a kind of a mechanical distribution of color, one has a Matisse. And this quality is here because there is a feminine quality of radiance that in Avestan was named Mazda. The radiance of the realization that mothers the birthing of everything. And the masculine complement to Mazda is Ahura, the Lord of recalibrating whatever goes astray to not bring it back into conformity with those plans, but to allow for it to have that cascade which allows for a waterfall of nourishment to occur as well. Kshatra is one of the 6 spirit helpers, Amesha Spenta in Avestan. And Kshatra is the masculine quality of being able to see to it, to see it through. Not doggedness, but that incredible efficaciousness to see it through. And what pairs with Kshatra, masculine Kshatra, is the feminine Armeti, love. Love that in the acceptance is the creative acceptance, the remembering acceptance that makes it all worthwhile, that the Kshatra can continue. Here's my translation of Zarathustra. His 4 Gathas divided into yasts. There are different numbers of yasts in the Gathas, and the very last Gatha has only 1 yast. And in that structure, there are verses called hats, and this is the 3rd hat of the very first yasna in the very first Gatha of Zarathustra. I to you, in Asha wreathing hymns, in Vohuman as circlets, to Mazda and to Ahura, through my Kshathra boundlessly, ever resonant in Armati, to my joy, my calling comes. These are qualities in a poetic which is noticeable for us when it comes to looking at very large-scale ancient things, not just the Gospel of Luke, misappropriating the Magnificat to the mother and not to the shared presence companion. It goes back massively to something as profoundly immense as the entirety of Indian civilization. At the founding, supposedly, of Indian civilization is the Rig Veda, 1,028 verses in 10 books that lay out the qualities, the procedures, the beliefs, the rituals, the symbols, the mythology, the visionary framings. All of it's there in the Rig Veda. All of Vedic civilization, which is India supposedly from its beginnings as a written language about 1500 BC. All of this is not true. It is true as far as it goes, but Zarathustra's Avestan, his Gathas were written 400 years before the Rig Veda. It's like us saying, well, no one could have written Shakespeare 400 years ago. How could anybody? It must have been a committee, or it must have been somebody else. That it's like a schoolboy from a little town on the Avon River? No, there's no way. Yeah, he did. 400 years ago. And Zarathustra, in his Gathas, creates the very poetic forms that are assumed and subsumed in the Rig Veda, but have a completely different quality of coloring to it. And that's because the massive influx of people were not like conquering warriors coming in and taking over the black, barbaric Indus River Valley deltas, so-called barbarians. They were fleeing the pressure of the Hittite Empire that was so great that it was already conquering Egypt and also conquering what today we call Iran. And they were pushed not only out of Iran, they were pushed out of Afghanistan. Because Zarathustra wrote his Gathas in what today is Kabul. He married the daughter of Okva, of the king. And all his relatives then through that marriage are named in the Gathas. Written in Avestan, because Avestan, along with Phoenician, was the core of the first written languages, not the first written languages at all. Those came about 4350 BC, and by the time of Inetuana, 2,000 years later, in 2350 BC, she was highly literate and poetic and capable, but in a cuneiform, Akkadian sophistication of ancient Sumerian. But the alphabetic language of the Phoenicians came into play about the same time that the Avestan language in Central Asia came into play as a viable written language about 1925 BC. And Zarathustra is the beginning of that written language that people called Indo-European, but you have to change the Indo, because India was a sophisticated urban civilization more than 1,500 years before the so-called Aryans' invasion with their Rig Veda and their Sanskrit. They brought the Sanskrit, but the Rig Veda is held by the loving care and ethos of India. It's not like Central Asia. It's not like Afghanistan. It's not like ancient Iran. It's India. And the Indic civilization, the Indus civilization, sometimes called, because of one of its two great cities, Harappa, the Harappan civilization. The other was Mohenjo-Daro. Those were cities that had several hundreds of thousands of people about the time that the Great Pyramids were being built in Egypt. They were metropolitan areas with sewage, plumbing, roads, architecture, and raising enough foodstuffs that they were really great at exporting food. This is before a lot of the river systems were messed with and produced what is today a great swath of the Rajasthan desert in India. All that was fertile farmland. All of it became like this immense dust bowl. And the original Indians had this sophistication that they did not have a warrior class. There are no Kshatra class in ancient India. They had a kind of a priesthood, but the priesthood was like administering a distribution to the population, that there was no barrier between them. They were not better than, their work was to make sure that all of it is real, but not to rule it. That whole language understanding, that whole revival of ancient India only began to really take hold in the 1920s. A British military genius named Sir John Marshall had enough clout and chutzpah and kshatra to make sure that his archaeological digs, especially in the bigger southern city, Mohenjo-Daro, were as ace complete as British Empire, stiff upper lip, exactness could make it, and in 3 great volumes published, reprints are still in print, showed that these people were sophisticated beyond almost anything one could imagine. There were great religious centers in Egypt at that time, like Giza. But there were no massive cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, who controlled a huge swath of area. Not only that, but their trading routes linked with the Akkadian, Sumerian trading routes that Sargon of Akkad, father of Enkiduanna, stretched his caravan shipping trading empire from the Indus River to the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean. All of this is the new past, and it took until just the 1990s for an Indian woman, whose books I've brought in from time to time, to piece together that the Harappan civilization, the Indus civilization, never died. It never died out. Still there. Still there in the sense that all through India one still finds the deep impress of the ancient wisdom before it was called India, even before it was called Bharata, that it goes back and still has its quality and surfaces in oases and pools of art and creativity. One of the pools is in central Deccan, the central desert, not Rajasthan, but the Deccan. And the capital of that Deccan is Nagpur. My teacher of the Bhagavad Gita was a soil agronomist from Nagpur at the University of Wisconsin when I was 19 years old. He said, you have to hear the Gita. You think you read a translation, you understand? It's not about understanding. It's about appreciation that can deepen. The other center of it that pooled was on the southern coast, the beautiful Malabar qualities where the trading routes were able to go across the Arabian Gulf, across that section of the Indus River in wind seasons to trade with Egypt through Ethiopia. And on the other side, the ability to go out and spread into the rest of Asia through going across the Bay of Bengal and down into Indonesia and so forth. So that you had this tremendous quality of being able to touch an immense swath of the earth. And when we come back from a break, we'll take a look at the way in which a architectural building in the center of the Deccan called Sanchi influenced the development of an architectural temple called Amaravati. Amaravati in Sanskrit means home of the deathless. Let's take a break.